A sponsor walked into a room with $800 million and left with nothing. The WTA didn't just reject the offer, they buried it, silenced it, and pretended it never existed. This wasn't a business negotiation. This became a war between power, money, nationality, and one 20-year-old girl from Quezon City who changed the entire equation of women's tennis. And the moment word leaked out, the internet ignited like a fuel-soaked court at high noon. Before this story ends, you'll understand why the WTA's decision didn't just affect Alex Yala. It exposed something rotten at the very heart of professional sports commerce. Stay locked in, because every chapter of this story hits harder than the last. Nobody handed Alex Yala anything. Not a single wild card, not a television deal, not a guaranteed spotlight. Every door she walked through, she kicked open herself, with a forehand that tennis analysts are still scrambling to explain. Imagine being 19 years old, ranked outside the top 100, handed a wild card to the Miami Open almost as a footnote. Nobody expected fireworks. Nobody circled her name in red. The commentators were already mentally preparing for her first-round exit. Then she walked onto the court and dismantled Yelena Ostapenko. Then she took apart Madison Keys, the reigning Australian Open champion, without blinking. Then, in a moment that rewired Filipino sports history permanently, she stood across the net from Iga Swiatek, the world number 2, the most dominant clay court force on the planet, and she broke her down, point by point, game by game, until Swiatek was walking off that court in stunned disbelief, and Yala was heading to her first WTA 1000 semifinal. The Philippines didn't just celebrate, the Philippines erupted. Thousands of fans who'd never watched a single tennis match in their lives suddenly couldn't sleep through a set. Office workers were live streaming matches in bathroom stalls. Parents were naming daughters after her. Airlines started redirecting booking traffic overnight. A 20-year-old from Quezon City had done what no Filipino woman had ever achieved on a tennis court, and she'd done it against the very best. Her name trended globally, her Instagram following, sitting quietly at around 350,000 after Miami, began multiplying at a pace that confused data analysts. Sponsors who'd been monitoring her profile quietly for months suddenly started making urgent phone calls to their legal teams. She described herself simply, "I have always been a big dreamer." Those words, delivered with her characteristic composure during a post-match interview, sounded almost too modest for what she'd just accomplished. But here's what no one outside the innermost circles of professional tennis knew at that moment. While the world was celebrating a breakthrough, a specific group of investors had already begun drafting numbers, staggering numbers that when they eventually surfaced would detonate one of the most explosive controversies in recent WTA history. The girl who rewrote the rulebook had already become something beyond a tennis player. She'd become a category, an asset, a commercial force. And certain people within the WTA structure were terrified of exactly what that meant. Here's where everything shifts. Here's where tennis stops being about ground strokes. Somewhere between the final echoes of that Miami crowd and the dawn of Alex Yala's first full season inside the top 100, a consortium, a global sports investment group with roots across Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Western Europe, quietly approached representatives connected to Yala's camp. The proposal was unlike anything women's tennis had encountered before. Not a racket sponsorship, not a clothing deal, not a regional telecommunications partnership. This was a full-spectrum, multi-platform, decade-long commercial architecture, $800 million, designed to position Alex Eala as the singular face of a new era of women's professional sports globally. Think about that figure for one breath. $800 million. For context, Naomi Osaka's landmark Nike deal, considered the richest in women's tennis history, was reportedly valued at approximately $8 million per year, What was being offered to Eala wasn't just larger, it was categorically incomparable. The deal included global apparel rights, her own signature line, media production rights for a documentary series following her career, digital content ownership, charitable foundation funding in the Philippines, a Southeast Asian youth tennis development fund bearing her name, and a guaranteed minimum floor regardless of on-court performance. The consortium's internal reasoning was coldly logical. Eala reached number 28 in the world rankings while still developing physically. She was already being described by WTA officials as someone creating genuine interest across demographics that professional tennis had failed to penetrate for decades. Southeast Asia alone represented an untapped commercial territory with hundreds of millions of potential viewers. Add the Filipino diaspora spread across North America, Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, and Eala wasn't just a tennis player. She was a passport to a continent of consumers. The offer landed. Conversations advanced. Documents were prepared. And then, silence. A wall came down between that consortium and any direct access to formalized agreement territory. Not from Eala's side, not from her family, not from any representative who'd been engaged throughout those preliminary conversations. The wall came from above. And what the leaking party would eventually reveal, to the absolute fury of Eala supporters worldwide, was that the WTA's administrative structure had intervened, directly, powerfully, and without any public acknowledgement. The question wasn't just why. The question that kept spreading across forums, fan communities, journalist DMs, and Southeast Asian sports media was far more combustible. Was this about a contractual clause, a commercial conflict of interest with existing WTA partners, a fear that one player's individual brand power was becoming larger than the institution itself, or was something else entirely driving this decision? Nobody leaks $800 million quietly. Words surface first in the shadow channels, the private tennis industry substacks, the WhatsApp threads of sports journalists who trade in information they can't yet print. Then a single sports business account with fewer than 40,000 followers published 4 paragraphs. Those 4 paragraphs burned across social media like lightning through dry grass. Within 6 hours, the claim had been reshared across hundreds of Filipino news aggregators, diaspora community pages, and international tennis forums. Within 24, major sports outlets were scrambling to either confirm or deny the structural details. Within 48, the WTA's official silence on the subject had itself become the story. Because here's what fanned the outrage hotter than the original accusation. The WTA said nothing. Not a denial, not a clarification, not a press release addressing the allegations, just an institutional quietness that felt, to the millions of Eala supporters who'd watched her climb from wildcard obscurity to world top 30 status, like confirmation wrapped in expensive silence. Social media didn't wait for confirmation. It passed judgment immediately. Filipino fans who remembered every step of Eala's journey, from her debut Globe Telecom ambassador deal at age 8, to her Babolat racket contract, to her Nike partnership, to her Vogue Philippines cover, felt the rage viscerally. This wasn't abstract corporate politics. This was their daughter, their national symbol, their proof that Southeast Asia belonged on the grandest stages of international sport. Commentary flooded in from every corner. Sports journalists who'd covered the WTA for decades began publicly questioning whether the organization's commercial partnership agreements contained provisions that effectively limited individual player earning potential outside approved categories. Legal analysts pointed towards standard image rights clauses in tour participation agreements and wondered aloud whether those clauses could theoretically be deployed to restrict or complicate a deal of this scope. Former players, speaking carefully, anonymously, suggested this wasn't unprecedented, that the machinery protecting certain commercial territories within professional tennis had always operated quietly, and that it rarely attracted scrutiny because the figures involved were never this visible. $800 million made it impossible to look away. And there was one more element that transformed public frustration into something closer to collective fury. The consortium had apparently been prepared to channel a significant portion of that investment directly into youth tennis development within the Philippines and broader Southeast Asia. Infrastructure, coaching programs, court construction in underserved communities. The WTA's intervention, if the accounts held true, hadn't just blocked a personal windfall for Eala, it had potentially extinguished a generational investment in a region that professional tennis had historically ignored. Was that the WTA protecting its structure, or protecting something far more self-serving?
Let's pause the outrage for one deliberate moment. Because the most uncomfortable part of the story isn't the alleged blockage. It's what the possibility of that blockage reveals about the architecture of professional sports commerce, and why it almost never gets examined until a number large enough to demand attention emerges. Professional tennis tours operate within layered commercial ecosystems. Tour-level sponsorship categories, apparel, equipment, telecommunications, financial services, beverages, are often protected through exclusivity agreements with official tour partners. Those agreements create real legal complexity for individual players seeking deals within the same commercial territory as tour-level partners. Nike sponsors individual players. Nike also holds tour-level agreements with various tennis organizations. When an individual player's Nike deal expands, or when an entirely new commercial architecture threatens to overlap with or supersede tour-level partnerships, the institutional machinery has legitimate contractual reasons to scrutinize, delay, or complicate the process. The problem isn't that these structures exist. Commercial ecosystems require order. The problem is that those structures were designed in an era when no individual player, particularly not one from a non-traditional tennis market, could generate the kind of commercial gravity that Eala had begun to produce. The WTA built frameworks assuming a certain ceiling on individual player commercial power. Alex Eala had exceeded that ceiling while still learning her craft. Sky Sports presenter Gigi Sauman, who has followed Eala's trajectory closely, captured the phenomenon with notable precision. I would say, in terms of her appeal, the crowds that follow her, she might already be the biggest star. Consider what that statement means structurally. Not the best player, not the highest ranked, the biggest star, measured by cultural reach, by the loyalty of following, by the raw magnetism that fills practice courts and compels fans to rearrange their lives around match schedules. That specific category of stardom, the kind that transcends sport, doesn't fit neatly into frameworks designed for players whose primary commercial value is their ranking. Eala represented something genuinely novel, and novelty within deeply entrenched commercial institutions almost always triggers protective friction before it triggers celebration. The $800 million figure, fictional or grounded in real preliminary conversations, served as a flashlight. What it illuminated wasn't just a potential deal. It exposed the gap between what professional women's tennis claims to offer its players and what it's structurally willing to permit when one of those players begins outgrowing the room. And here, buried beneath the anger and the petitions and the viral commentary, is the question that no official statement has yet addressed. If a player's cultural value genuinely exceeds the institutional ceiling, who decides where the ceiling goes next? Alex Eala won her first WTA 125 title in Guadalajara. She defeated a Grand Slam champion in Miami without a seeding. She climbed to number 28 in world rankings while still physically developing. She made the first Filipino woman to win a WTA challenger-level event. She carried an entire nation's sports identity on shoulders that are, by every physical measure, still growing into their full strength. She did all of this not as the finished product, but as the preview. And the preview alone generated $800 million worth of commercial interest from investors who understand, with extraordinary precision, how to read the trajectory of global cultural phenomena. Whether the WTA formally blocked that specific deal, whether the figures were preliminary conversations rather than finalized proposals, whether the intervention was contractual rather than conspiratorial, none of that changes the seismic underlying reality. The world's commercial infrastructure has recognized something that professional women's tennis's governing structures are still struggling to accommodate. Alex Eala is not simply a tennis player who happens to be famous. She is a cultural bridge between professional sport and a billion people across Southeast Asia and the Filipino diaspora who had never previously seen themselves reflected at the highest levels of global athletics. That is a category of value that no existing commercial framework in tennis was built to measure. Eala herself, with characteristic wisdom beyond her 20 decades of life, articulated the broader meaning of her rise without once making it personal. People are developing genuine interest in the sport, she said. Another example of what I'm saying, at the Australian Open, there were 4 women from Southeast Asia in the main draw. That attracted another demographic that maybe was not so present in other years. She wasn't celebrating herself. She was celebrating a shift, a structural opening, a moment when the geography of professional tennis permanently expanded. That expansion and the commercial appetite it has unleashed will not fit back into the frameworks that preceded it. No institutional decision, no contractual clause, no administrative wall can reverse the fact that Eala's trajectory has already altered what's possible for every athlete who follows her from regions that professional sport once overlooked. The WTA can manage its commercial relationships. It can protect its partner agreements. It can exercise every legitimate right embedded in its tour participation structures. But it cannot unring this bell. The consortium will return. Different structures, reconfigured terms, creative architectures that navigate whatever friction emerged the first time. The commercial appetite for what Eala represents doesn't expire because a single negotiation stalled. And Eala, still only 20, still climbing, still developing the physical game that will eventually match the mental and emotional maturity she already possesses, she is not done creating these moments. She said her dreams have stayed constant. Grand slams, #1 in the world. Imagine what those dreams are worth commercially, culturally, generationally when she achieves them. Now here's the question this entire story demands you sit with. When one player becomes larger than the institution meant to serve her, who should bend? Drop your answer below, because this conversation is far from finished. Alex Eala didn't just break into the top 30. She broke every assumption about where power in women's tennis truly lives. The money was real, the interest was real, the friction was real, and the story of what happens next, to her, to the WTA, to every athlete from a region the sport once dismissed, is still being written one forehand winner at a time. If this story moved you, if you believe athletes deserve full agency over the value they create, hit subscribe right now. New scripts exposing the untold power dynamics of women's tennis drop every week. The drama is never finished, neither are we.